have Patricia Helmuth. Patricia is a New York State teacher leader in math who's been teaching in adult education for 11 years. She specializes in teaching math to students at all levels, and she currently teaches in a fast-track math class for Sullivan County BOCES in New York. She's on the board of ANN as the newsletter editor. She's also a staff developer for the Hudson Valley Regional Adult Education Network. And she's participated in both state and federal initiatives in an effort to develop and share CCR-aligned resources for adult math instructors. Her three statements: Patricia rode a horse down a major highway between New York and New Jersey. True. Patricia can say supercalifragilisticexpialidocious backwards. I know Julie Andrews can. And Patricia once swam alongside whale sharks, snorkeling in Cozumel. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome Patricia Helmuth.
So good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Tonight I want to talk about our multi-level students that we all have in our classrooms, right? And this raises a lot of questions about how to best individualize instruction for our students. And there's a particular question that I've been thinking a lot about lately that I'd like to share with you. Whoops. So my question is, can we individualize instruction for our multi-level students while at the same time provide all students with equal access to high-level math? And I ask this question because when I first started teaching in adult education, I would test my students. The test would tell me what level the student was at, and then I would give that student individualized instruction by way of a color-coded workbook that corresponded with the color-coded test that they had just taken. So the questions they got wrong, they would work on in those workbooks. And that being the case, students rarely worked together. They just worked in these workbooks that were designed to help students to memorize procedures. But I learned really quickly that my students weren't good at memorizing procedures. And one particular student comes to mind, and I'm going to call him Abe, because he was at the ABE level. And when it came time for Abe to take his post-test, Abe broke out into a cold sweat as he was hunched over this exam. And it was horrifying. And I just couldn't imagine how he felt. How did he feel? But Abe was stuck in a box. All my students were stuck in a box. It didn't matter what level they were at. And not only were they stuck in their level box, they were stuck in one of these boxes, because the workbooks prescribed that they work on only one content area at a time. So how could I get my students out of all those boxes? Well, not long after Abe, I was exposed to some training in mentoring by founders of the Adult Numeracy Network, Donna Curry and Pam Meter. And then after that, I had some great training by two people in this room, Mark Truskowski and Eric Appleton. And as I sat at tables with other teachers where we were learning math together, and I have to tell you that I was not at the same level as some of those other teachers, but it did not matter because we all sat there solving problems, and that was the point. Let's find a way into this problem. And I have to tell you, I felt so good when I was able to solve a problem, even though I didn't know the procedure for it. And that's what I wanted my Abes in my class to feel. But with doing that kind of thing, doing that kind of instructional strategy or learning environment, would that work with multi-level students in adult education? Well, I wanted to find out. So in 2014, I conducted a practitioner research project that was sponsored by ANN. And in the project, the students that participated their scores were all over the place. They ranged from 3.0 to 9.0 in their intake exams. And yet, I had all students at all those levels participate in the same task in group work. And I had some surprise findings. My first big surprise finding was that my lowest scoring students excelled. And what I mean by excelled is that when these students would work in groups, I often noticed that it was the student who was at the lowest level who was able to find a solution to the problem and had to actually prove that his solution was correct to the higher scoring students. And yet all of those students were sitting at the table and they were all learning. So my second surprise finding was that 79% of the students who participated, who started the study, got a gain on their test. So the test scores were good, and of the 21% who didn't make a gain, most of that was due to students who had stopped out, so I just did not have post-test data for them. And this was a small-scale research study, but larger studies have shown that providing all students with equal access to high cognitive demand tasks works. For example, Joe Bowler at UQ talks about a study where there was two groups of students. And in the first group, they were mixed abilities. All students had different abilities. The second group, they had separated the students out into levels. And at the end of the semester, guess which group scored the best on the exams at the end? The multi-level group. And I love this quote. She says, working in mixed ability groups of students doesn't bring down the high achieving students. It actually works in the opposite way and brings up the bottom. And she made the comment that the higher level students just soared. They just soared in that kind of environment. But, you know, I have up there high cognitive demand tasks. So you might be wondering, what does that mean? Well, here's an example of a high cognitive demand task. And I know I'm not giving you enough time to really read it or think about it. But for those of you who are familiar with this problem, you know that a systems of equations is going to solve that problem right away. Now, if I was still using those color-coded workbooks, I never would have thought to give this to an ABE student. It wouldn't have crossed my mind. But what if I take the lid off that algebra box and I provide equal access to all of my students at all levels to this kind of problem? Let's see what happens. Here's an example of a student who found a way into that problem you just saw using pictures. These are two more examples. One student tried to organize their information. Another student used guess and check. All three of those are valid ways to solve problems. Not one of them used systems of equations. They all came to the correct solution at the end of the day. And so this kind of begs the question, are we allowing our students to find their own way into these high cognitive demand tasks? And if we are open to that possibility, how would we do that? Well, there's really no one right way, but this way is one way, and it's called push and support cards. And basically the way this works is that you have one task that you give to all your students. And then we have cards ready, available to hand out to students. And so some students who are struggling, you might hand them a card that says, draw a picture of the situation. Or you might hand them a card that says, use manipulatives to see if you can, that will help you to answer the question. Now, a student who's already done with the task, you might have a card that you hand him, and that card says, can you please draw a graph from the data that you have collected from the work that you've just been doing? And so at the end of the task, all students have been working on the same task, yet they've all taken it to a place that was just right for that student. They've all walked away from the task with new mathematical thinking, new learning. They've all taken the lids off of boxes because they found the different ways that the ideas in those boxes connect. And so this is an example of different levels that students had taken the task to. And you might think, well, that's great, but you know, there's new tests out there, and you may be worried and have some concerns about those new tests that your students are going to be exposed to. So my call to action is take the lid off the boxes. Provide equal access to high cognitive demand tasks for students at all ability levels, and don't limit your students to ability level test prep materials. Try something new like math memos or push-in support cards, and analyze how this impacts student learning and conceptual understanding of mathematics, as well as their performance on tests. And then please help us to keep this conversation going at the Adult Numeracy Network website. Thank you.